A big part of communicating effectively, and particularly when thinking about influencing others through communication, is negotiating. So, I want to spend a little bit of time in this next topic talking about how we can communicate effectively. And as part of doing that is also talk a little bit about problem solving and conflict management. So, when we have conversations, when we're communicating with other people, whether they're in written or verbal form, often it's a process of negotiation. Two different agendas, or very similar agendas but different ideas or views on how to get things done, come together, and we have to come up with a plan of action or an agreements on how we're going to proceed forward. And all that is about um, negotiating. It's about collaborating. Sometimes it's about problem solving, and it all involves um, good assertive communication. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that, because when we enter into negotiation, it really is it's a process of clarifying what we want, sharing that, and trying to determine what other people want, clarifying that, and trying to get an outcome that we're both happy with. So when entering into a negotiation, it's important to do your research and to consult and collaborate with key stakeholders to identify your needs and the position of the other party. So, very first thing we should think about when going into negotiation is to say, okay, we're about to enter an important discussion with somebody. As part of that important discussion, there may be uh, to-ing and fro-ing around some key issues, so that I'm well prepared and I'm not caught on the hop. Because if you're like me, I always like to say I'm a deep thinker, not a very quick thinker. I don't do very well on the hop. I'm much better if I've had time to think about things beforehand. So for me, I think, okay, I'm going into this conversation. We're going to perhaps, have a challenging and robust discussion around certain issues. Where do I stand on these issues? What is my ideal outcome? What is it that I want to get out of this? What is the very minimum that I'm willing to accept out of this? And I try and find out my range of bare minimum to what I want to get. And that's really my negotiating band. I don't want to go any lower than my bare minimum. So I've thought about that beforehand, so I don't get dragged into somewhere that I don't want to go. And I've thought about what it is that I want, so I can express that clearly. And I also do the same with the other person. What do I think is what do I think they want from um, these particular issues? What do I think they're willing to accept as the most foremost bottom position of theirs? And that's their band of negotiation. So, and that might take some research, and whether it is talking and consulting other people, or whatever the case may be, it's having a good understanding of where you sit and what's your band of negotiation, and where do they sit and what's their band of negotiation, and then being prepared to enter into those negotiations. So when we're entering into the negotiation, making sure that we're assertive, making sure that we state clearly what our needs are, and that we're open and honest through the whole process, as much as you can be, taking into account things such as confidentiality and privacy and sensitivity I talked about earlier. But as much as we can be, being open and honest with people and say, look, this is really where I stand on this matter, and this is really what I want out of it. Please share with me, what do you want out of it? Please be open and honest with me in terms of where do you stand on it. Now let's get into some robust discussion around this. And we can then start to think about what we're willing to give and take as part of that. And of course, as I said before, if you've done your planning and you've anticipated some of those things, you'll be better prepared to respond. A couple of things that we should um, really just make sure that we consider at all times when we're entering into negotiation and when we're in the discussion. That is, at all times, we must be calm and collected. If we feel that we're getting too wound up into the emotion, we've got to give ourselves some space, take a break, but making sure that we stick to the facts, making sure that we, as much as possible, don't let the emotion cloud our judgment and cloud the issues at on discussion, and staying with a optimistic and positive outlook that we can achieve a positive outcome. That's the goal. Part of that is about making sure that we're exercising good leadership behaviors, such as being polite and respectful, active listening, effective questioning, all those things that we just talked about in interpersonal communication skills. Must be prepared to be honest and justify your own needs without exaggeration, because once people feel that we're being dishonest, or we're not being transparent and we're being opaque, then they're going to do the same thing. And it's really difficult to get to a good, successful collaborative outcome, or a good compromise, if people are having these hidden agendas and not being open and honest. So that we've got to be prepared to do that. We've got to be prepared to lead by example on that. The other thing is that we should always be working towards a collaborative outcome, a win-win outcome. And I'll talk more about this shortly, but that's really what we should be striving for. And then the fallback position is a compromise where we sort of give and take. And as I said before, the more that we can plan and do this, the better the plan to do this, the better we can be. We don't want to be. It's just the same as if you're going to buy a car. You want to know, or even if you're to go into, say you want to go into buying any significant asset, you want to go beforehand. You want to know how much you want to spend, and what's your bottom top limit. So that way, if you get drawn into the discussion, you know where you have to stop, and you know how far up you can go. And this is no different. We're thinking about those things before we go in, so that we don't get drawn into any areas that we're unprepared to go into. I mentioned about collaboration, and I just want to talk a little bit about Stephen Covey's model on problem-solving conflict management, which was based on Kenneth Thomas and Ralph Kilman's model of assertiveness and cooperativeness. And just think about this in terms of negotiation, or just any terms, difficult conversations. Covey said that when we get into a conflict scenario, a problem-solving scenario, there are a number of positions we can take. And I want to bring up this slide just so I can talk through this. So you're going into negotiation, and you've done your preparation. So as part of your preparation and where you're at, you know what your needs and your wants are. So that's on this axis here. So what are my needs and what are my wants? And what's the other person's needs and wants, because you've done your research with them as well. So you have a pretty good understanding. If we get to an outcome that is just highly focused on your needs and wants and not the other person's needs and wants, so up here on this axis, it's fully max, and on this axis, and on the same axis for the other person, this person here, it's minimal. We're taking maximum on my needs and wants, minimum on the other person's needs and wants. We're taking a competing position. A competing position is where I'm highly focused on what I want to try and achieve and have little regard for the other person. On the opposite end of that scale is the accommodating position. The accommodating position is where we have high regard for the other person, but little regard for us. So in a negotiating, when we're competing, we just want to get what we want, and we don't care what the other person wants. When we're accommodating in negotiating, we want to give the other person whatever they want, and not going to focus on getting what we want. In an avoiding situation, avoidance is where we're not even going to bother negotiating. No one's going to get what they want. So in terms of my needs and wants, it's minimal. On the other person's needs and wants, it's minimal. When we talk about win-win, we're talking about collaboration. Collaboration is where we are focused on getting what we want. So it's highly focused on our needs and wants, and we're also highly focused, ooh, that's not so straight, on the other person's needs and wants. This is a collaborative outcome, otherwise called a win-win. So when we talk about collaboration, we're always talking about this: get a win-win outcome, where you get what I want, where you get Freudian slip, where you get what you want, and I get what I want. And of course, I was talking about before, this is what we should be striving towards all the time. And only if we can't, then our fallback position is a compromise, where we get some of what we want, and this is where we fall within our band. We know that that's within our band. We can accept anything in this area here, and the other person, this is their band of things they can accept within there, and the compromise is the middle ground. So when we're very messy, but hopefully you get where I'm coming from with that. So when we're talking about uh, working collaboratively, getting to a collaborative outcome, it really is about focusing on my needs and on your needs and trying to find a solution that meets both. Now, while I'm here, I also want to talk about different communication approaches. Instead of talking about needs and wants in terms of this axis here, let's talk about just your message and here others' message, the other person's message. When we talk about communication approaches, an aggressive communication approach is one where we're highly focused on our message and not on the other person's message at all. So we don't really care what they've got to say. We're just trying to get our message across. So aggressive communication doesn't necessarily have to be by volume or being loud or waving our fists and whatnot. It just means our intent, and our intent is aggressive because we're not listening to the other person. We're just getting our message across. On the other flip side of that, of course, the opposite side of aggressive communication is passive communication. Passive communication is where we may have something to say, but we're not going to say it. We're just letting the other person have their say. So these are really at both ends of the spectrum, and they're not really sustainable communication methods. If one person's if everybody was just focused on their message and not listening to everybody else, we wouldn't get any good communication going. So, and it's a little bit more complex than this, but just for the purpose of today and this discussion, when we think about assertive communication, we're really thinking about communication where each party gets their message across. And the best way to do that, I feel, because I always think it's nice to listen to other people first. Assertive communication, for me, the best way to do that is to say to somebody, okay, can you just share with me what it is that you want from this? And this is like in negotiating context. Someone will say, well, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for this, this, and this, and this, and this. And I'll go, okay, terrific. So this is what you prefer. This is how you want it. This is, what you want to try and avoid. So I'm using my paraphrasing and reflecting back, and I'm getting confirmation. People are saying yes. And then I can say, okay, now can I share with you what I want? So I've listened to the other person, I've confirmed their message, and now I'm making sure that I'm heard as well. And by doing that, I'm using assertive communication. I'm listening, but I'm also making sure I'm heard. So when we're communicating in an effective manner and we're collaborating with other people and we're negotiating on outcomes, we want to make sure that we understand where we're all coming from. We've got agreement on what the issue is, what our needs are, what we're willing to negotiate on, and we commence a discussion on that. And whilst we're discussing that, we focus on those needs. We're not necessarily going straight to solutions. We're really just clarifying what everybody wants out of this. And then once we're clarified what everybody wants, then we can start to brainstorm possible solutions. And the reason why we want to clarify those needs before we brainstorm is because we want to make sure that we're clear when we start to throw ideas up against the wall and see what sticks. The brainstorming process is really creative, and I've talked about this in other units. So we go through the whole creative process. We don't evaluate while we're being creative. We're we're divergent in our thinking. We're throwing ideas out there. We're capturing all these ideas. Then once we're exhausted the ideas, then we go back and we evaluate because there's two different processes that are going on in our brain. So we process, we evaluate, we work through what potentially might be good parts of one solution, good parts of another solution, and we might put together a plan that best meets everybody's needs. And then we put in an action plan into place. What's going to happen? When will it happen? Who's going to be responsible? When will we check whether it's on track? And by doing this, getting agreement in terms of what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're going to do it, who's responsible for what, and how we're going to review and evaluate. And of course, as part of that, there's a few things we want to be wary about um, around around working collaboratively, and the main one, of course, is making sure that we handle the emotions before we start getting into the actual critical thinking of problem solving. Um, Problem solving in itself requires critical thinking. However, if anybody is highly emotive within that process, it's very difficult to engage the critical element of the brain. So, and we can think about it just from our own personal experience. Whenever we've been in a situation where we're being cranky about something, it's very hard to be rational when you're emotionally tied into something. So sometimes it's about creating space. Sometimes it's about having a breather. Sometimes it's about talking through some of those emotions. Someone might be cranky or upset or frustrated by something, and just working through those first. Then when we work through those, then we can start to engage the critical part of the brain and start thinking more about those problem solving steps I talked about before. Other challenges is where we don't actually get to the root problem, where people aren't transparent, they're not being open and honest because they're trying to run with a hidden agenda, and we're trying to work at a superficial level rather than at the root of what the main issue is. I've talked about earlier about the problems with trying to get too critical when you're being creative. So making sure that we don't evaluate or classify solutions as when we're in the brainstorming session. Let's do the creative stuff first. Let's do the brainstorming, then do the evaluative stuff. Then not working out the details of who, what, when, how to make sure that we managing the logistics of the solution to ensure that the failure doesn't come from not executing it. It might be a great idea, but if we haven't executed it properly, it's not going to work. And then making sure that we have that review. Another trap is not having a review or follow up in there. And just some other general things to think about as well. Um, Generally speaking, some people are better at being collaborative and working with others to solve a problem than others. So some, just by natural trait, some people are more competitive, some people are more passive, and just always being aware of that from a leadership perspective, that sometimes you have to uh, manage those nuances and dynamics as well. And also, workplace culture falls into this as well. In a highly competitive workplace culture, it gets harder to get people to work collaboratively. And the challenge for many businesses is about being collaborative internally, competitive externally. So you're competing in the marketplace and everyone's thinking competition in the marketplace, but we're collaborating and thinking team inside the workplace. And that can be a real challenge, but it's something to just be aware of as leaders and managers. Also to be aware of that negotiation, collaboration, problem solving all take time to do it well, which is often one of the traps that managers get into is that you don't have the time. So you get into this autocratic thinking where you're just like, we don't have time to discuss this and work this out. Just do it my way. And in some cases, in emergencies, that works really well. But if you start to make that your default position, you you start to get really cranky teams because everybody within your team feels that they'll have something to contribute and they want to contribute and don't want to be necessarily that micromanaged all the time. Um, and sometimes, you just get teams that are afraid of conflict, having difficult discussions, especially if you haven't got a robust culture around treating people with respect or how to communicate with respect. And people aren't confident or don't know how to challenge an idea without uh, making it feel like it's a personal attack on the other person. So, having good values in the workplace, having good code of conducts and ethics, doing things such as really promoting effective feedback where people can challenge other people's ideas but still recognize positive things as well. So not everything's a negative discussion, and it might be, um, point one, two, three are really great. I want to talk about point four, and leading into that, this idea of constructive feedback, not critical feedback. So no good at just telling someone, hey, you suck or that sucks, but to say, I think that was really good, but I've got some. I think I've got some constructive ideas to add to that. That those that's the sort of framework that you need in the workplace for those challenging conversations to occur, or robust conversations to occur.